Hi there, welcome to our 27th lecture. In fact, let's quickly recall what we did in the last class. We began with the concept of world literature because we premised it on the fact that before we come to terms with contemporary global poetry, we need to come to terms with the concept of world literature as such, and we trace the concept and the word back to Goethe and how it was first introduced in 1827 during Goethe's interaction with his friend Eckermann and all that. And from there we moved on to understanding the concept of world literature as defined by David Damrosch, a contemporary scholar, professor of world literature at Harvard University. We also began understanding the pros and cons of a work entering and becoming a part of world literature, and what are the processes through which a literary work enters the global market and becomes part of world literature, and how Rabindranath Tagore in as early as 1903 proposed the idea that literature is one organic whole rather than looking at it in a piecemeal manner as literature of this particular nation, literature of that particular nation and all that. We need to consider literature as one whole organic unit and all that, and how that kind of a concept was also backed by Marx and Engels, and how they looked at their entire manifesto as probably the first prototype of world literature. We also discussed some of the valid concerns related to world literature and what happens, what are the losses when a particular regional work enters the portal of world literature and all that. Nevertheless, we also understood the global imperative to keep those concerns and offset those problems with the strengths of world literature, and that is the reason why we said we need to go ahead with the translation and world literature. In this class, we are going to discuss one remarkable poet, thanks of course to translation and thanks also to the concept of world literature. Otherwise, of course, such a remarkable voice, such a poetic genius, there was no chance at all for that voice to be heard across the globe, and it was a pity for us because we need to be pitied because we would be deprived. We would have been deprived of listening to the great literary voice. Therefore, we are beginning with our discussion of one of the finest poets who is available to us through English translation and who is also a major part of world literature. Before we move on to the poet, I want you to consider a few lines. When you are lonely, when you feel depressed, when you feel there is no one around you, just think of these lines and then let's see how you respond to them, and afterwards we move on to the poet. All right, if you are ready, let's go and see some of these lines. All right, here comes your first piece. I wish I could show you, when you are lonely or in darkness, the astonishing light of your own being. Now consider this, you are lonely, you feel as if there is nobody next to you, or you feel let down. That is when these words can become an extraordinary companion to you. Now think of these lines. What are these lines trying to tell you? What are these lines trying to tell you? I wish I could show you, when you are lonely or in darkness, the astonishing light of your own being. We may not be able to see that, but once when we realize the kind of light that emanates from us, we may not be aware of that, right? We may not be aware of that, but people who can see can spot extraordinary light emanating from us. And if that day comes, if that moment comes where we can see that, that's when we lose the feeling that we are lonely and we begin enjoying our own company and live a beautiful life of a lifelong companionship with ourselves. So, the poem beautifully talks of establishing a beautiful rapport with ourselves. Once that happens, of course, no turning back, right? Yeah, look at another line. Ever since happiness heard your name, it has been running through the streets trying to find you. In fact, here we are always crying, saying that there's no happiness in our life, we are not happy, this and that. It's the other way around. It's the other way around. Actually, it's not that we are in search of happiness, but happiness is also equally in search of us. Once we realize it, our outlook towards life itself changes beautifully and dramatically. Ever since happiness heard your name, it's been running through the streets trying to find you, right? It's trying to find you, so don't worry. In fact, you are also trying, but more than you, happiness is also trying to find you. It will reach you, don't worry. In fact, more than you, happiness is eager to find you. Such extraordinary optimism, right? Beautiful optimism. Consider this. O wondrous creatures, by what strange miracle do you not so often not smile? O wondrous creatures, by what strange miracle do you so often not smile? Why is it that you don't smile? There is so much to smile around, right? All the while we behave as if an entire planet has fallen on our head. For small things we behave as if, because see, how do we gain happiness? Usually if there is a small mismatch here and there, we feel the entire world has fallen on our head. But now if we can develop a sense of proportion, scale, in other words scale consciousness, you have heard of different consciousness, scale consciousness, then automatically you develop or we develop happiness. What is the scale consciousness? Now look at this. How big is the universe? How big is a solar system in that universe? And how big is our planet in that universe? And how big is our nation in this planet? How big is your village in this planet? How big is our family in this planet? Now look at the proportion. And if something small things, if there is a mismatch here, we start behaving as if the entire world has fallen on our shoulders. On the other hand, just look around how beautifully the sun has been carrying out his duty, how seasons are changing, how trees are working on their own beautifully. The moment we learn to connect with our surrounding, the moment we learn to connect with our surrounding, then the inverted curve becomes a beautiful curve and we start smiling. After going through these lines, wouldn't you be interested in knowing who this great guy is, who has made you realize so much about your own self? Of course, at least we have grown an inch taller because we have come to know so much about ourselves, right, that we didn't know. So, would you be interested in knowing this guy who made you feel a little more happy and a little more tall? Okay, here comes the guy. We are discussing an extraordinary 14th century poet who lived and wrote in Persia, and today the world knows him as the poet for life, Hafiz. Of course, there are different spellings to that name, Hafiz, Hafez and all that, but we are referring to the same guy. In fact, he comes a century later than Rumi, another mystic Sufi poet. But of course, you can see a continuation of the legacy that Rumi left behind in the poetry of Hafiz. So, Hafiz is the one who made us smile, who made us realize that we are not alone in this universe. Sometime between 1315 and 1390, he lived in Persia. Okay. And in the last class, you remember I said, Goethe's concept of world literature was greatly influenced, or it was triggered by his reading of Hafiz, Kalidasa and Chinese novels. Hafiz played a major role. In fact, after having read Hafiz, that Goethe realized the importance of floating world literature. That is why he went on to declare Hafiz as having no peer. There is nobody equal to Hafiz. That is true in a sense. Who do you think is Hafiz? Who was this poet? Okay. Hafiz, a short name. Hafiz is a short name. Zaja Shamsuddin Muhammad Hafizi Shirazi. Hafiz is his pen name, lived in the 14th century, Persian poet whose collected works are available to us, of course, and whose works themselves constitute the pinnacle of Iranian culture. In fact, Persian culture gained a lot from the works of Hafiz. The question comes, when he lived in 14th century, do people still read him? Of course. Don't we read Kalidasa? Don't we read Tulsidas? In fact, like Tulsidas, who is now a household name in India, because we read Ramcharitmanas with folded hands. It's acquired an iconic status. Similarly, people read Hafiz, and anybody who has realized the importance of Hafiz would read, not just people of Iran, but people throughout the globe, including our Goethe, Tagore and others. All right. So, let us take a look at his life from a closer perspective. Why was he called Hafiz? Before that, Hafiz was born in Shiraz. Of course, during those times we did not have the concept of history as we have it now. Of course, there existed historical consciousness, but that presented itself in a different way through stories, through legends, through poetry and all that. So, not in the exact sense of a date, and we know it now, that is a Western notion of history. So, in that sense we do not know much of his details, but whatever we know are through stories written by his peers, maybe his successors and all that. Legends say that he had a kind of an enviable memory. He was so good that he could recite the entire Iran. Legends say that he memorized the entire Iran in such a way that he could as well recite it in any which way people wanted him to recite. All right, that is why, considering his legendary power of recalling, he was called Hafiz. Hafiz means a true memorizer or the safekeeper who has committed an entire culture, an entire word of God, the so called word of God, holy word in his memory. So, that is why he was called Hafiz. Okay. Hafiz of course enjoyed patronage of many kings, and they knew his importance and they continued their patronage. They extended their support in all possible ways, but it's said that his work flourished especially under the 27-year rule of Jalaluddin Shah Shuja. He is popularly called Shah Shuja. So, his work find a succor, a literary and cultural succor during the regime of Shah Shuja. Okay. And Hafiz also exchanged, it is said that of course while discussing Hafiz's links with India, he had an extraordinary links with India in the sense that he corresponded with Ghiyasuddin Azam Shah of India, and he had even invited Hafiz to come to India and stay here for for some time, but unfortunately that did not materialize, but otherwise they were familiar with each other. So, that is an active India connection that Hafiz enjoys. Okay. 20 years after his death, of course, a tomb was erected in his memory, Hafiziyah. Okay. And of course, even to this day that acts as an epitome of great love, great compassion and unequivocal devotion to God. Of course, Hafiz himself has come to symbolize an extraordinary or profound love. His poetry talks about an uncanny love that exists between the creator and his or her creation. Therefore, even to this day, Hafiziyya stands testimony to his love and what, of course, the creator's love for his creation. Hafiziyya, the tomb of Hafiz. Okay. He was, of course, he was acclaimed as one of the greatest poets throughout the Islamic world during his lifetime. Of course, most of the times it so happens with the writers that during their lifetime people do not appreciate their value, they do not even know their value, it is only after their death. In fact, death gives the poet a new lease on life. It is only after the poet dies that he starts living again in a in a paradoxical way, you can say that. So, I mean, fortunately for Hafiz, even during his lifetime he was well recognized and rewarded. His first translation, I mean not his translation, the first translation of his work was made available in English in the 18th century. Of course, remember that was the time William Jones also played a major role in translating many of our Sanskrit works into English. But of course, after Orientalism, Edward Said's Orientalism, we know how this also becomes a colonialist agenda to further the goals of imperialism. Whatever they may be, it was in 1771 that William Jones first translated Hafiz and made the entire Western world familiar with the greatness of Hafiz. And he was so popular that even Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, I am sure you will have read some of his stories, the detective stories, Sherlock Holmes. Even there he says, there is as much sense in Hafiz as in Horace, and as much knowledge of the world. So if Horace, the Greek poet Horace is the epic poet, is considered as an epitome of or one of the greatest poets, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle goes on to the extent of saying that Horace and entire world knowledge put together constitute the greatness of Hafiz. To that extent, Hafiz is important to us. Thanks to several translations today, we have extraordinary access to probably almost we have access to everything of Hafiz or most of what Hafiz wrote. So his Parsi lyric poems, which are written in the styles of Ghazals, are available to us thanks to translation. Okay. So, as we said, some of the prominent concerns in his works include a kind of a tussle between love and reason, because reason or rationality, the concern of rationality is our welfare in the here, whereas the concern of love is our welfare in the here as well as in the hereafter. Therefore, there is a kind of a tussle between love and reason, and most of the times love wins over reason for rightful reasons, right? And of course, that is the reason why his poetry, of course his poetry does it in a beautiful, elegant and mystic ways. So, you can no wonder if you find him one of the extraordinary mystics that you have read. Mysticism, his poetry is steeped in Sufi culture, Ghazal tradition, and of course, it reeks of mysticism in the most positive way that we can think of. So, and more than that, they are spiritual, true, but they are not religious. If we do not know the distinction between being religious and being spiritual, it would be really unfortunate, because if we are religious, religion may make us, it may create dogmas, but not so much spirituality. Religion has or operates within certain socio-political, geographical boundaries, whereas spirituality has no boundary. Therefore, spirituality, so in the best spiritual tradition, his poetry exemplifies the relationship of human beings with the Creator. It knows no religion. All right, that's the reason why most of the religions and establishments, the ruling establishments, they find at the firing side of Hafiz's poetry. Hafiz's poetry almost offers a pungent critique of established religion and monarchy and things like that. So these are some of his these are some of the translations that we have of Hafiz. Faces of Love, translated by Dick Davies, published by Penguin Classics. And of course, we have the Collected Lyrics of Hafiz of Shiraz, translated by Peter Avery, and it was also awarded with Iran's Farabi Prize. Considering the quality and contribution of this particular book in spreading the word of Hafiz, Iran government of course honored the poet translator with Farabi Prize. And we also have Daniel Ladinsky's The Gift, poems by Hafiz, the great Sufi master. So if you are really interested in finding a lifelong companion for yourself, or if you need to actualize, if self-actualization is what you desire, then probably you can begin with the poetry of Hafiz. So let's take a quick look at what Hafiz says, some beautiful remarkable lines, so that we have a first-hand taste of what he writes. What do sad people have in common? He asks and answers, it seems they have all built a shrine to the past and often go there and do a strange wail and worship. What is the beginning of happiness? It is to stop being so religious like that. Well, why are we unhappy? Because we start recalling an unhappy incident that may have happened in the past, and we start cribbing about it and wailing about it, making it some kind of a religious ceremony. That's probably why many people are happy, or most of us are happy. So when do we, most of us are sad. When do we begin feeling happiness? Of course, when we stop being so religiously attached to the past and so religiously getting attached to the future. Remember, in one of our earlier classes we said that past, present and future. When you tug yourself with past, or when you tug yourself with future, it's you don't know what path it leads to, but it also leads to unhappiness. Whereas if we realize that present is all we have and start living every moment of our life completely, that's when we become immortal. We also discussed this concept, right? Immortality is not living forever, but living every moment we have as if that's the final moment, living fully, completely in that moment. That's when we can say. In fact, here we can recall a quick and a short Zen story, right? Once there was a restaurant owner who was searching for a great Zen master. Of course, because of his preoccupation, he had to serve his guests. He couldn't go anywhere, right? One day he found a strange guest, sipping a cup of tea, holding that cup of tea in both his hands and sipping every sip of tea as if that's the last moment, or as if that's the only thing, that's the last sip that's available, something like that. That's when the restaurant owner realizes that he has come face to face with the greatest Zen master. How do you know? Because a true Zen guru is one who knows the importance of the present and lives totally in that moment. So probably Hafiz highlights on that ability to live in the present, and that's the route to happiness. What we speak becomes the house we live in. Look at these lines. Look at these remarkable lines. What we speak becomes the house we live in. When we utter something, these are not dry sounds. When we speak something, either with our friends, either with our family members or anywhere, they are not just dry sounds. they have an aura to them, they have a dimension, and they are capable of constructing something. So, if I utter a positive word, it creates an abode for me in which I can live. If I utter an unpleasant word, it creates a house around me, and you and I have to start living in that. Therefore, how about saying positive things? How about saying pleasant things so that we get to live in the pleasant thing, in the pleasant house, isn't it? And then be kind to your sleeping heart. Take it out into the vast field of light and let it breathe. Let it breathe, looking at your own heart as if that's your companion, and going out, enjoying nature, bonding with nature. How is it? And here is a remarkable short poem which I really like and enjoy a lot. Ever since happiness heard your name, it's been running through the streets trying to find you. You have already read this, right? Ever since happiness heard your name, it's been running through the streets trying to find you. Look at how excited happiness is to find us. Once when we know that, we grow less fearful of the past and less anxious of the future, and start living the present in a complete way. Okay, yeah. Here is another great poem that celebrates the concept of togetherness in a remarkable way. How the world can't afford disunity. How in unity lies life, and in division lies our death. Dividing among the people, division of people leads to death, and uniting them gives them life, something like that. Out of a great need, we are all holding hands and climbing. It's an eternal journey. Imagine our life as one big pilgrimage or one big journey. If you are not a believer, no problem. If you are not a believer, you don't need to be a believer, but you have realized that life is a journey, right? Life is a journey. So then in this journey, all of us who have cohabited this planet, we are climbing this because we are traveling together. That's the reason why we need to hold each other's hand. We need to hold each other's hands and climb together. That's the need. No loving is a letting go. There is no option for us not to love. If you don't love, then it's a letting go. You are pushing somebody down, then the chain becomes weak, and if the chain becomes weak, we also fall down. Remember, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, all right? So what is the weakest link here? If the entire humanity is in one big chain, then if we let down one individual, the strength of the chain comes down. Therefore, we need to go together for that. Listen, the terrain around here is far too dangerous for that. So let's not do that. Let's hold each other's hands and walk together. A great need. A remarkable poem that highlights on companionship with the entire world, not just with people around you, but with the entire people that exist across space. And another beautiful poem that highlights the connection, or an umbilical connection that exists between our Creator and us. Now, we are like lutes once held by God. We are like lutes once held by God. Being away from His warm body fully explains this constant yearning. Sometimes we feel, there is some kind of a vacuum. Most of the times we may feel this vacuum, some kind of an emptiness. That's because, we have been away from God. So probably that vacuum can be filled when we reconnect ourselves with God. It's through God that we, seek our life, or because we are away from God or godly, that's why probably we feel, a little less connected. So if we can, of course, that can also happen once we start connecting with people around. He is not being religious here. In fact, what he is saying is, the next poem should make it clear. When Hafiz talks of relationship with God, it's not in a religious sense, it's in a spiritual sense, because he is capable of finding God in all the faces. So as long as we can connect with even fellow human beings around us, we are in touch with God. It becomes clear to us when we read subsequent poems. Greatness is always built upon this foundation, the ability to appear, speak and act as the most common man. Of course, all these poems have a Zen-like quality. Of course, they are not haikus, but they are inspired by the spirit of haikus, because using minimum words they impart maximum meaning, maximum meaning. So, key to greatness is to not show off, the key to greatness is to appear, speak or act and then disappear. To live in being common is an extraordinary way of becoming uncommon or becoming extraordinary. That is a key to becoming extraordinary. Yeah. And look at this, the heart is right. The heart is right to cry even when the smallest drop of light of love is taken away. Why do we cry? Most of the times we cry, right? Why do we feel? Because we feel a drop of light or a drop of love is taken away from us. That is why probably we cry, and nothing wrong in that. Let us not be ashamed of crying. Let us not be ashamed of crying, because crying both psychologically and spiritually is a way of filling the void within us. It is a way of filling the void within us. That is why perhaps you may kick, moan, scream in a dignified silence. You may do whatever you want. Still we cry, and you are so right to do so in any fashion until God returns to you. So, in other words, you can even call crying a kind of an invitation to God, an invitation to God. So, if you think you are crying a lot these days, or you feel like crying, do not worry, you are just calling out God, and God will appear to you, or your companion will appear to you in some way or the other. You will find the spirit that is going to uplift your life in some remarkable way. So, if you are crying, that means you are just calling out, that is all. Okay? It is a prayer to meet something great. Yeah, here is that is the reason I said he is not religious but spiritual. Now, look at it. He says, I have learned so much from God that I can no longer call myself a Christian, a Hindu, a Muslim, a Buddhist or a Jew. These are just divisions. Religion sometimes creates this division. Not the best element of religion, but religion has certain not so best elements. Therefore, so that those kind of worse elements create division. So, he says, I do not consider myself any of these things. The truth has shared so much of itself with me that I can no longer call myself a man, woman, an angel or even a pure soul. These are just distinctions. These are just distinctions. Love has befriended Hafiz so completely, it has turned to ash and freed me of every concept and image of mind has ever known, that my mind has ever known. If you are truly possessed by love, if we are truly possessed by love, then we cease to believe in this division, because when we look at a fellow human being, all that we can see in him or her is some compassion, some element of love. Of course, let us take a quick look at his life. Please remember, we do not have the details of life in a Western sense of history, because we had our own concept of history, but of course, as we have already identified, it was through poetry, it was through literary works that history was recorded. Therefore, whatever account of Hafiz we have, it is only through his own works and works of his contemporaries and successors that we have. So, let us take a quick look at some of his achievements, how he lived, the situation, the context and all that. Okay. Hafiz was born in Shiraz, Iran, and of course, as I said, we do not have the biographical details, but we know much more about him through non-Western notions of history. Legends say that he memorized the entire Quran, and that is the reason why many of his contemporaries called him Hafiz, because Hafiz meant the memorizer or the safekeeper. He knew his Quran in any which way he wanted to recall. That's the reason why he was called Hafiz. Of course, later he used that name Hafiz as a pen name in all his works. One important thing that we have to keep in mind as far as Hafiz is concerned is that he enjoyed patronage under several rulers. In fact, many kings supported him because they had realized the importance of his works, they had realized how great Hafiz was. Therefore, they extended their full support and cooperation to this poet. More than anyone else, of course, who supported and who extended his patronage to Hafiz was Jalaluddin Shah Shuja. During his 27 years rule, he promoted works of Hafiz in remarkable ways. That's the reason why, of course, he was considered a well-known figure throughout Iran. Okay, and what is remarkable is there is a peculiar India connection to Hafiz because he seemed to have exchanged letters with Ghiyasuddin Azam Shah, and who was the Sultan of Bengal, who was also a well-known patron of the arts and poetry. The Sultan of Bengal wanted Hafiz to visit India and stay here as a guest for some time. Unfortunately, that did not materialize. That did not prevent them from writing to each other and getting to know what they wrote and all these things. I am sure you enjoyed these poems. Before we call it a day, probably you can just take a look at another poem or maybe another poem, and then you can read some of his translations available. I am sure you will find a companion for life in Hafiz and his great works. Thank you.